Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday, and welcome to another AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. Thanks so much for joining. We are very excited today to welcome Dr. Jonathan Javitt, founder, chairman, and CEO of NRX Pharmaceuticals. Looking forward to kind of diving into the world of psychedelic-related medicine and learning a little bit more about NRX Pharmaceuticals itself. We've definitely seen a ton of interest in the world of sort of psychedelic-related medicine, so very psyched to kind of be able to spend time and connect you to experts in the industry. So again, if you're out there, one, thanks for joining. We really appreciate it. But two, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to throw out, I see Stevie. Hey, Stevie. You are always welcome to throw them in the chat, and we'll try to get to some at the end if we have some good questions. With all that said and out of the way, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Great to have you on. I figured just because it's your first time on, I'm sure it's kind of a regular thing, but would love to kind of start with your background, how you got into this industry, how you decided to kind of start a company like this, and then get into kind of our NRX kind of at a high level as well.
Well, I certainly didn't come into this from a traditional perspective. In fact, some people think I failed psychiatry in medical school. But I did start out as a physician, graduate of Cornell University Medical College, Harvard School of Public Health, became an eye surgeon, and I'm still a professor of ophthalmology at Johns Hopkins. Along the way, I became a neuroscientist, got involved in drug development, spent some time in several White House administrations, working both on issues related to healthcare delivery and national security as 9/11 happened and we all got distracted. And was involved in starting a number of companies in the healthcare space. Never imagined that I'd find myself in this domain. But along the way, my brother Dan Javitt had a much more traditional career in psychiatry and neuroscience. And back in 1987, Dan was the first to recognize the role of something called the NMDA receptor in the brain. And that's the switch in the brain that literally controls a lot of the pathway around psychedelic medicines. But it also controls schizophrenia and depression in some profound ways. Think of it as the brake pedal of the brain. If you have too much NMDA activity, your thoughts are slow to a crawl. You don't have many new thoughts per minute. Those thoughts that you have are frequently pretty negative in nature. But more importantly, you lose what's called synaptic plasticity. That's a terrible and complicated word, but it's really synaptic plasticity is the extent to which brain cells reach out and touch other brain cells and form new thoughts. So those same mechanisms that cause depression and especially suicidal depression in people can be shown in the laboratory to result in the shrinkage of brain cells and the failure of brain cells to form new connections to other brain cells. Add a drug like ketamine, and all of a sudden those cells start sprouting again. And all of this is new science. It's science that we've really started to understand just in the last 10 years. So then the question is, well, how did I get involved in this? Because I was busy, developing drugs for glaucoma, for macular degeneration, other first-in-class medicines, many of which are still used by patients today. And had an experience in 2009 where my best friend, one of the leading doctors in the United States, who ran the whole pain control trial program at the National Institutes of Health, developed an episode of depression, was treated with a standard antidepressant, and within a week hanged himself. And I'd like to say that that's a special story. It was special to me, but unfortunately, it's not special to Americans. In fact, an American commits suicide every 11 minutes. So at a time in medicine where we've really bent the survival curve for many forms of cancer. When I went to medical school, breast cancer was a lethal condition. And today, breast cancer is a chronic disease. My mother tragically lost her younger brother to childhood leukemia at the age of 5. And today, almost nobody dies of childhood leukemia. At a time when we bent the survival curve in extraordinarily positive ways for many of the diseases that kill Americans, used to kill Americans routinely, we've done almost nothing to bend the survival curve for suicidal depression and PTSD. So having had that experience, having lost a dear friend to this disease, I started talking to my brother and saying, well, what are we doing about this? What are you doing about this?
Yeah.
And that was about the time he had done some of the first trials and been involved in some of the first trials for NMDA antagonist drugs in treating depression. We fully expected that big pharma would jump on this and this would be commonplace within a couple of years. And instead, just about everybody in the pharmaceutical industry exited the psychiatry space. So in the space of 5 years, J&J, Merck, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, Lilly, all left psychiatry. And in many ways, they did it because the generation of SSRI antidepressants was going generic.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, everybody realized by this point that all of those drugs caused suicide. So we wound up in this crazy situation where a major scientific breakthrough had been made. We're seeing a whole new generation of drugs to treat suicidal depression and PTSD in extraordinarily positive ways. And yet Big Pharma was not interested in the space. And that's how we came to found what was then NeuroRx. And when we went on to the NASDAQ, it became NRX Pharmaceuticals.
That is quite a story. And I think definitely ties into, having that personal connection and that personal story. I do think, most people out there probably know somebody that has been affected by, suicide or even just, extreme depression and things like that. So it definitely needs a better approach. I definitely think of the available options, like you're saying, they're not the best fixes necessarily. And I think it's sort of a time to have new tools and new approaches. I think there's a re-embracing of kind of psychedelic related medicines and treatments. So I think that has been very positive. In terms of if we do see sort of larger companies and big pharma kind of re-embrace, we'll have to wait and see. I think I have seen a few stories of J&J kind of with Spravato and kind of getting back a little bit into the mix. So hopefully that's sort of, as the data comes out and proves out, something maybe that can be re-embraced. But in the meantime, I think it's great to be, creating new tools and creating new treatments for all sorts of different.
I think J&J has done better with Spravato than they ever imagined they would.
Yes.
And hopefully that will motivate Big Pharma to come back into this space.
I think that's true. I do wonder how much of it is almost, because from what I've learned about psychedelic related medicines and things like that, is the results seem to be surprisingly off the charts in terms of how much of an impact they seem to be able to have with kind of these more complex ailments. So I wonder if also part of it is just having more data to prove it out and to, be able to say it's not too good to be true and say, wow, these treatments really do have a long-term impact, whether that's increasing neuroplasticity or, just allowing sort of time to heal from.
And, psychedelics kind of a scary word.
It can be.
I'm not sure I could imagine what I would do if I was CEO of a big pharma company, because I can't imagine ever having that job.
Yes.
But psychedelic, literally relates to hallucination.
Mm-hmm.
It's a word that came from the world of abuse drugs.
Yes.
And not from the world of pharmaceutical development.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should be a little bit careful about assuming that the psychedelic side effect is actually essential or even important to the therapeutic benefit.
Interesting.
Because what we're really doing is creating new connections in the brain.
Yep.
In the case of depression, what we see, and some of this is work that Connor Liston published in Science, the leading basic science journal in the world. Mm-hmm. In the case of depression, what you're seeing is that at high levels of NMDA activity, the little dendrites, the little projections on nerve cells that connect to other nerve cells, atrophy. And nerve cells just stop reaching out and forming new connections. Mm-hmm. In the case of PTSD, we don't have quite that level of laboratory confirmation yet, but we all believe that there are hardwired pathways where a negative memory, a traumatic memory, is so ingrained in us that it gets reactivated at the worst times. And somehow we need to use medicines and other therapeutic techniques to break that hardwired memory so that people can think creatively again.
Yep.
None of that necessarily means that we have to make people hallucinate. And for instance, TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, is an FDA-approved treatment. It's highly effective for depression. It's increasingly being used in PTSD, and I'm sure that there will be TMS approvals for PTSD in the near future. TMS doesn't make anybody hallucinate, and yet it creates these very substantial benefits. Now, ketamine is a highly hallucinogenic drug. But D-cycloserine, which we use in the oral medicine we're taking through FDA, for the most part, doesn't cause hallucinations. It can, but part of what Dan Javitt discovered is that if you combine it with a typical antidepressant medicine, you block the hallucinations, but still get the therapeutic benefit. So when we use the word psychedelic, we use that word because it's what we know. Yep. We know that many of these drugs have the habit of causing hallucinations. But similarly, aspirin has a habit of causing bleeding in the stomach. When we talk about using aspirin to treat patients, we don't say we're going to use stomach bleeding drugs.
Sure, that is true.
So it's important for all of us to be a little bit humble and a little bit scientifically curious about the extent to which the psychedelic side effect of these drugs is really going to be with us long term as we continue to understand the powerful way in which these new drugs help the brain form new pathways in a manner that gives us what may be the first cures for these lethal conditions.
Yep, I definitely agree. And maybe you're right. Maybe there is something to do with the language and how it's presented and almost kind of giving it a rebrand, kind of separating it from, the 1960s and kind of using it recreationally and more putting in that clinical element, putting it in that medicine element. So maybe we'll have a new term or word for it that will help kind of tell that story eventually. But we'll have to see, how that plays out. You have mentioned, I think, a ton of between PTSD and depression, the types of ailments and types of therapies that you're working on at NRX. Would love to, could you give us a kind of high level view in terms of your current pipeline, kind of what you're working on and what's sort of in the mix?
Sure. And what we've told investors is that this quarter we're taking, in a sense, old-fashioned ketamine through the FDA because nobody's ever gotten an approval for it. So you have this funny situation where intravenous ketamine that many people think works better than Spravato is only FDA approved as an anesthetic. And even though patients and doctors often say they prefer it to nasal ketamine, you can't get paid for by insurance for the most part because there's no FDA label for use of this drug in treating depression. So we intend to fix that. And at the same time, the original presentation of ketamine that was developed for use in the operating room has a toxic preservative in it, something called benzethonium chloride. And if you look that up on the internet, you wonder, why would you ever want to put this into your body? It's a highly toxic substance, even if it's used in very small quantities. And the reason is when they originally, back in the day, an anesthesiologist would have a cart full of medicines and draw up a little bit of this and a little bit of that for one patient and use the same vial for another patient. So these vials had to have a preservative in them. Now, that's not even legal in hospitals anymore.
Good. It sounds like it shouldn't be.
These days, you can't use the same vial of medicine for more than one patient, but the preservative is still in there. So we've developed a preservative-free presentation of ketamine. And while we're at it, we've put some anti-diversion features into the packaging to make this a drug that's much more likely to be used for medicinal purposes, much less likely to wind up in the recreational world. And by taking the toxic preservative out, hopefully improve patient safety in the process.
I think that's fantastic. In terms of working with something like ketamine versus something like psilocybin, is there any benefit, or how does that work in terms of moving it through the approval process, given that ketamine is Schedule 3, but some of those other drugs are Schedule 1 and a little more tightly controlled? Is there any
Well,
difference there?
not only the Schedule 3 part, but ketamine is already an approved drug. That means that there's an extraordinarily long history of safety that the FDA already knows about. And it's a drug that's clearly safe to use in humans. Now, we don't know how many times you can use it in humans, because ketamine, no matter how effective it may be in the short term, and it's highly effective, the clinical trials data shows that within a matter of hours, ketamine reverses symptoms of depression and suicidality. Nothing else does that. But we also know that if you give it to primates, to non-human primates, for 90 doses, you create permanent damage to the brain. So somewhere between 1 dose and 90 doses is a safety threshold for ketamine, and we don't know exactly where that safety threshold is, and it needs to be learned. In the case of psilocybin, we really know almost nothing about its safety, and probably all of us have a friend that we see at college reunions who still hasn't gotten their act together after too much psilocybin in college.
Perhaps that's true. I think you're right, though. It is maybe a case of too much versus, if you're using it in a controlled way. But I think definitely having that history is important for ketamine. I think that, which is, do you have any plans for?
I see a pop-up question asking, are we doing anything with psilocybin? And NRX is a pharmaceutical company, is not currently developing a psilocybin-like drug. The drugs that we're developing right now work on the NMDA receptor in the brain. That's the same receptor that ketamine binds to, and our oral drug NRX-101 uses D-cycloserine, which is sort of a kinder, gentler way of modulating the NMDA receptor. It's a little bit like turning a faucet instead of putting a cork in the pipe. Psilocybin and that whole class of medicines affect a different receptor in the brain, something called the 5-HT2A receptor. And as you've implied, much less is known about them. They're much wilder drugs. The FDA expressed some real concerns in turning down the MDMA approval. And MDMA has nothing to do with NMDA, except that they sound a little bit alike.
Sure, that is fair. I do think that there is a lot more, research in general that needs to be done, and I think that is kind of working through, but also kind of like you're saying, education, it would be easy to confuse those two things just because they sound kind of similar. So I think that there is still a lot of education, both from a patient perspective and an investor perspective, that continues to be done. So doing things like this is very helpful, I think, to provide that education. So appreciate it there. I do want to kind of turn to the, business and kind of how things are going. But first, just because we were talking about ketamine, I did want to ask, in terms of like public perception, how things are changing around ketamine. I know we have some pretty, high profile political figures or just kind of people in the media currently who have talked about ketamine, use for therapy, kind of promoting more, looking into alternative therapies like psychedelic related medicines. What's your kind of view on how it changes, how the public view on ketamine has kind of changed recently?
Well, I think there's absolutely no question that ketamine as a short-term drug for stabilizing people with severe depression and PTSD has shown a tremendous amount of efficacy. And the clinical trials that we'll be bringing to the FDA involve a study done by the French government and 7 French psychiatric hospitals where they showed a profound treatment effect. A study done in 100 patients at Columbia University in New York, where they showed a profound treatment effect. A number of other trials gathered together by researchers at Yale, where they showed the same profound treatment effect. We're unaware of any study of any magnitude where a profound treatment effect was not seen. And there's now more than 20,000 patients of real world data collected by a company called Osmind, which provides the electronic medical records for a lot of psychiatry practices, where the same treatment effect seen in clinical trials was seen in real world. They call it real world data.
Mm-hmm.
So the evidence that this is a drug that should be approved, that needs to be approved, from our perspective, is overwhelming. Now, the evidence is a little different than the evidence FDA is used to seeing, because it wasn't gathered in clinical trials done by large pharmaceutical companies under some of the same rigorous conditions that pharmaceutical companies do their work. And it would be impossible today to do the kind of trials that were done for Spravato, because ketamine is now mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go to a patient and say, well, we want to randomize you to ketamine versus placebo because we don't know whether ketamine's effective, because we've lost what they call equipoise. We've lost the ethical ability to say to a patient, we don't know whether this drug's more effective than placebo, and therefore we want to randomize you to one versus the other. Truth is, we do know.
Interesting. Yeah. It's better. It's effective. Nice. Okay. That's really cool. I feel like in terms of obviously seeing those patient stories and seeing things move ahead and kind of a general public embracing of ketamine as a medicine, would love to kind of turn to the kind of company side, corporate side, investing side for that. What's the appetite been like, from an investor perspective? Have they warmed to the story? Have they been able to see sort of the opportunity that, a lot of the data has been able to support? How has that sort of gone from
Well,
an
I
investor
think
appetite?
investors have warmed to the story, but our story has changed quite drastically in the last 6 months.
Mm.
So what we realized is that no matter how effective our drugs may be or may not be, and we think they're effective,
Mm-hmm.
medicines alone are not sufficient. And as we've looked around the landscape, you find a ketamine clinic on almost every street corner.
Sure.
And a lot of those clinics are sort of med spas that do ketamine on Monday and vitamin drips on Tuesday and God knows what on Wednesday.
Sure.
And they're not run by mental health professionals. They're not run by people who can really give the patient the whole spectrum of care that's needed.
Mm-hmm.
And just walking in the door and getting an IV drip of ketamine is a terrible idea.
Sure.
The other side of it, though, is ketamine probably has about a 50% benefit. So it's critical, and nothing works as fast as ketamine. But from our perspective, it's not sufficient. That if you really want to offer the patient the full spectrum of benefits, you have to include, I'll give you another terrible word, neuromodulation.
You must be very good at Scrabble. I feel like this would be very solid. But yeah.
And that's a broad term for treatments like transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
Even electroshock therapy is a fairly brutal form of neuromodulation, where you're using non-pharmacologic mechanisms to cause brain cells to regenerate, to form connections to other brain cells. And TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, is now shown and approved by the FDA as an effective treatment for depression. And people are probably going to get an approval for PTSD pretty quickly. So there are very few clinics that we've come across that are able to effectively combine medicines like ketamine, treatments like TMS, and this whole new world of digital therapeutics, where you can give the patient an app that actually has a therapeutic benefit. I got involved in this about 25 years ago in a very different way. There was a community of warfighters that had adopted transcendental meditation, mm-hmm. saying that it improved their combat performance. And I was working with a colleague who's now a member of our board together with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the idea was, well, can we take TMS and put it into a computer game and teach people to get the benefits of TMS without having to teach people to meditate? Because the average rifleman is not very interested in learning about meditation.
Sure.
But it turns out the essence of meditation is synchronizing breathing and heart rate. So with funds from DARPA, and DARPA is always kind of looking around the corner. That's how they invented the internet. We built this computer game that, in fact, taught somebody to win the game by synchronizing breathing and heart rate. And then took people into the combat simulator at Quantico and demonstrated that they shot more bad guys, shot fewer friendlies, but surprisingly had much less stress on the back end, lower levels of cortisol. Other measures of stress were markedly reduced among the people who had used this, what we now call digital therapeutic. And then they took it into first responders, firefighters, EMTs, and showed lower levels of depression. And this is just one example of this rapidly evolving field of digital therapeutics that we believe is going to be the third leg in the stool. So we realized that without building a new system of care, probably you're not going to be able to take care of patients the right way. Just unleashing ketamine on everybody is a terrible idea. So Hope Therapeutics is a clinical delivery company that is in the process of standing up clinics that will combine what you called psychedelic medications, what we might one day call something else, but will combine medicines that improve brain pathways with neuromodulation techniques like TMS that improve brain pathways, and digital therapeutics that improve brain pathways, all under an umbrella of state-of-the-art psychiatric medication management and therapy.
That's fantastic. So coming at it from multiple angles and not just sort of, again, having just releasing medicine, coming at it from that full perspective. And again, ultimately, I think from an investor perspective, probably more interesting, I think, in general than just kind of one single form.
We're convinced that medicine alone can't do the job.
I think that's fair.
What I've sort of likened this to, a lot of people know a company called DaVita that has really made kidney dialysis a reliable and consistent therapy across the country. If you're a DaVita client and you're traveling from New York to Chicago and you go in for dialysis in Chicago, it's going to be very much like the treatment you get in New York, and you can trust it. And we aim to do that for the 50 million Americans who have depression and PTSD. That's
a good model to follow. And again, I think some key ailments to really try to tackle that, unfortunately, are pretty pervasive in the US. I definitely agree there. I do want to just quickly spend a little bit of time highlighting. I feel like we're only a month in roughly, but it's been a great start to the year for you guys, both in terms of funding and kind of on a stock performance perspective. Anything that you can kind of tell us as we're starting out on 2025 so far, the highlights on that front?
Well, I think sometime last December, a lot of investors gave us up for dead, and if you're a Monty Python fan, clearly we weren't dead yet.
There you go.
And just 2 days ago, we announced $37 million of new funding. Not so much for drug development, because the development activities we're pursuing are focused around FDA approval. That's not very expensive, although it can be nerve-wracking.
Sure.
And most of that money is used to acquire and build Hope Therapeutics clinics. And while we're attracting some investor money, in fact, we just attracted a fair amount of investor money.
Good.
We expect that money will be leveraged 2 or 3 to 1 by banks at much lower rates of interest. So we've told investors that we intend to have $100 million of revenue on a going forward basis by the end of this year.
That's pretty impressive. Yeah. Okay. That's pretty impressive. And then I guess looking into the rest of the year, where is sort of the focus? Is it more on those clinics, more on hope, sort of more in that element, or where are you kind of
Well,
growing
we
into?
have essentially three teams.
Mhm.
We have the team that's developing the Hope Therapeutics clinics. We've announced our first acquisitions. Uh, there's a lot of paper going back and forth,
Mhm.
uh, but we expect that those acquisitions will start to close in the month of February.
Nice.
And there are many more behind them, because if we're really going to hit our $100 million target by the end of the year, that team has a lot of work to do.
Sure.
We have this second team that is driving the FDA applications for NRX 100 ketamine and NRX 101.
Mhm.
So you think of it as a business where we've signaled to investors that we're going to be a real business this year.
Yeah.
And whatever happens with our drug approvals, we're going to be a real business that stops burning investors' money. That's
Yeah.
our objective.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we get a drug approved, that's a moonshot. Typically a business like ours would go from being worth a couple $1 million to a couple $1 billion by getting a single drug approved.
Yeah.
And then we have a third team that's looking at some new acquisition opportunities. I think we've said out loud to investors that we're looking at a very interesting drug that could be the first disease-modifying drug for schizophrenia. So when I was a college student, every day on the way to class, I'd walk past a guy on the bench in front of the Princeton Library who was wearing red sneakers, had hair down to his waist, and was talking to people that nobody else could see. And his name was John Nash. They even made a movie about him. Russell Crowe played him in Beautiful Mind. He was a guy who developed schizophrenia while he was a graduate student, but nevertheless developed game theory and won a Nobel Prize for it.
Sure. That's great.
All of the medicines we have for that disease are tranquilizers that in one way or another quiet the voices by turning down the volume in the brain.
Yep.
Nobody's ever dared talk about a drug that could turn off the fire in the brain. And we may be looking at one of those opportunities.
That's fantastic. Yeah, definitely having finer controls in terms of, you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're really able to kind of specifically target the negative elements of a disease, which is fantastic. All right. Well, then I guess heading into 2025 as well, I did want to just touch on very briefly environment-wise for kind of similar types of companies, but also, of course, NRX itself. I feel like, rates could be going lower potentially. I know we've got a new administration that seems friendlier, kind of on the ketamine side and things like that. Anything that you have your eye on in terms of the environment we're coming into for the rest of the year to kind of keep an eye on?
Well, the what I call the binary biotech market, where companies either succeed or fail, has been terrible for the last 2 years. And largely it's been terrible because when interest rates are high, people are very happy with the returns they can get on very low risk investments. When interest rates are low, especially we went through a period of time where interest rates were actually negative, that's when people are more likely to invest in riskier but high reward entities like biotech companies.
Mhm.
So unless there's a dramatic reversal in interest rates, I think biotech money is going to continue to be hard to get.
But
And
not impossible, as you've proven, I feel like.
not impossible.
Yeah.
But to an extent, we've proven it by saying we're not going to be a binary biotech company. We're actually going to make money for our investors.
Yeah.
And in the clinics, we're not going to make as much money as you could make by getting a drug approved, but we're going to make enough money to be a real company.
Yep, I think that's fantastic. All right, well, looking forward to all the work that's coming ahead in 2025. It seems like you have definitely the table set in terms of your path forward, which is exciting. Would love to mention, if anyone is out there and is following along, learning more about NRX, where are some good kind of resources, places they can go to kind of stay in tune and up to date with kind of your company's story?
It's really been fun talking to Mackenzie.
It's been great. So I would say, would you direct people towards your website and maybe LinkedIn and Twitter? I just want to make sure people can
I
stay
think
in tune.
our website has up-to-date information, and it's probably more likely to be up to date than social media.
That makes sense. Perfect answer. Well, so again, if anyone's out there, definitely take a look, learn more. But thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Again, it's an area that I think requires more education and excitement and interest. So appreciate you taking the time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll catch you again. Bye.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.